Game over, man. Game over.
Johnny. You're gonna need a bigger potion.
So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for November 13th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hello, thanks everyone for joining us for this conversation. So, earlier this week, yesterday, as this episode is released to the public, we talked about Sean Baker and Nora.
Yeah.
Sean Baker, we love. Nora, one of our most anticipated films of the year. The same thing, the exact same thing can be said about one Steve McQueen, a filmmaker that we adore, that we quite love, that we revere. He has his first film on the big screen since 2018, which is wild to think about.
I keep forgetting about how long it has been. I sometimes forget about... I don't forget about the Small Axe movies, but I guess I forget the scope of them, that must have taken so long for him to do because it was essentially 5 movies, right?
Yeah.
So I guess it does make sense as to why we haven't seen a feature film like this from him for quite some time.
Yeah, absolutely. It was 405 minutes altogether, the Small Axe anthology. Yeah. And then let's not forget, and I can't remember where I talked about this, but I did talk about it on a previous main show episode. Maybe it was one of our catch-up episodes. His documentary, Occupied City, that came out last year. Yeah. That film is like 3.5 hours.
Yeah, I still have not
really
seen
long.
it. I still have not seen it.
Yeah, so it is a lot to get through. So he's been busy. When you make a documentary that is nearly 4 hours, and then you have an anthology that's 400 plus minutes.
Yeah.
He's been working. He's absolutely been working. However, obviously the documentary wasn't really released in theaters, at least not widely, maybe in New York and LA. Yeah. And the Small Axe anthology was released via streaming as that came out during the pandemic in 2020. So this is his first time coming back to the theaters, the theatrical distribution here with his latest film, Blitz.
Yeah, kind of surprised us too, right? Because I feel like the film sort of came out of nowhere. You know, when we talked about some of our most anticipated films of the year, I'm not even sure if this film was certainly on our radar, but I don't know if it was on our radar for this specific year yet, was it?
Oh, it was my number 5. Yeah.
Okay, so you were pretty confident that it was coming out, but it was one of those cases where I feel like the trailer, the poster, the announcement of it came, and then the movie was already here like a month later. It seems though, which was a very interesting strategy.
Yeah, I do remember looking it up back in January and feeling confident that we were getting it this year. I do remember talking about it on that episode, our most anticipated of the year back in January. I was very excited because it was Steve McQueen coming back to theaters with the great Saoirse Ronan, and it being a historical epic that takes place during World War II. And like it checked all the boxes as far as my sensibilities go. It's like Steve McQueen, love him. Saoirse Ronan, one of my favorites working today. World War II, history nerd. Yep. We got it all. So I was like, man.
Childhood perspective?
Childhood perspective, mother and son getting back together. Like, surely this was going to be my favorite film of the year, right? Like, that's how it felt like it was building toward.
It's tailor-made for the In Session Film podcast.
Yeah.
It really is.
100%. Yeah, so I've been deeply looking forward to this film all year. Was very, very excited to get a chance to see this in theaters because this is coming to Apple TV Plus fairly soon in the next couple of weeks. So I am grateful that I got a chance to see this in theaters. Although, funny enough, I was the only one in my theater. The only person.
I was one of 5. So I wasn't the only one, but it still was not a big crowd whatsoever.
Which is pretty rare for me these days. When you live in Lexington, and Lexington is, a fairly small market. So sometimes you go to watch a small indie, maybe you're the only one there. And when I lived in Gainesville, especially, it was even worse there. I would often go see movies, especially because, again, of my lifestyle, and I have to see movies at 9, 10 o'clock at night, 2 kids and all.
Sure.
That I would see smaller movies, and I would be the only one there when I lived in Gainesville. Now, I live in the Fort Lauderdale area now, so it's much busier. It's more compact here.
Yeah.
It's very rare that happens, especially when I go to a big multiplex like Cinemark, which is what I did for this one.
You're essentially in a greater Miami area now, so of course it's going to be more populated.
Exactly. So I don't really get those opportunities very much, but with Blitz, I got Steve McQueen and Saoirse Ronan all to myself.
That's the beauty about, for someone like me living so close to Philly, is that I get a movie like this. And we joked about this on episode 610, GD. I actually corrected myself. I had Juror number 2 playing, and then I didn't.
Yeah.
Well, lo and behold, I'm actually getting it this weekend again. So
really?
it is coming back.
Warner Brothers can't make up their mind.
I might have to see it. I might have to go prioritize it just because I don't want to miss it.
Yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to make that work. I don't even know. I'll have to look that up if I can even get a chance to see it. But I don't know. It's Clint. The film may never come to light unless you see one of these theatrical screenings, because who knows what Warner Brothers is going to do. I might just have to make the trek. But at any rate, we're here to talk about Steve McQueen. We're here to talk about Blitz. So let's go ahead and dive into this one. Blitz is written and directed by the great Steve McQueen. It stars Saoirse Ronan, Elliot Heffernan, Harris Dickinson, Benjamin Clementine, and a bunch of others that come and go. If you're not familiar with Blitz, it follows the stories of a group of Londoners during the events of the British Capitol bombing in World War II, also known as... Brendan said it, the Blitz. Yep. He was
Didn't
right.
know you were setting me up. I was about to say Blitzkrieg Bop.
All right, Brendan. What do you think about Blitz?
I was too busy looking up something when you set me up for that failure. How dare you?
No, you're good.
All right, well, let's go back to something we were saying earlier, and that's a movie like Blitz is tailor-made for the In Session Film Podcast. It's tailor-made for you. It's tailor-made for me. And let's talk about more attributes that exist here that really make it a film for us, that you and I were really looking forward to. A lot of it really comes down to the tonality that Steve McQueen is attempting here. This does have a lot of his trademark things, we'll simply say, the way that he relishes in surprise darkness. He does like to surprise you with something that really is going to let you like waft in something devastating, right? And there are definitely elements like that here. Feels very modern in that regard, very visceral. But Blitz also has a very different quality, especially with regard to war films. I've seen some people compare this to Steven Spielberg's War Horse, and I do think that is a pretty fair comparison given the narrative trajectory that George, our main figure, goes through. It is pretty similar in some ways.
Sure.
And by focusing on a young figure like George, the film is clearly inspired by Charles Dickens. This is very much an Oliver Twist-like narrative.
Yeah.
So Steve McQueen is basically taking his usual trademarks, tapping into a very Dickens-like mentality, while also looking back on some of the classic war films from, let's say, the 1940s. I was actually thinking a lot about our 1940s Best Picture movie series earlier this year, JD, with movies like Mrs. Miniver, for instance. I think it has some of those old-fashioned qualities. And by giving it more of a Charles Dickens-like lens, I like the idea of a movie like this existing for really all audiences. Like a younger audience can actually go and experience this and maybe learn something from it. I just wish I liked the movie. I really did. I don't know what it is. Maybe we'll be able to dissect what it was about Blitz and why it didn't land for me. I think if anything, maybe it is that synergy between Steve McQueen's traditional trademarks and some of these other traditional trademarks he's trying to bring into it. I don't know if the mixture works. This is also a case where it looks like Steve McQueen was the sole screenwriter for the first time, as opposed to writing with other people or adapting other people's material. And I do think the script writing here is perhaps one of the film's biggest problems, alongside the editing. There's the fusion of these different things make a movie that feels very disinterested in the material. I think it doesn't feel committed to what I think it's trying to go for, and that really saddened me, because I like what this movie is attempting. I wanted to love this movie. This is the type of movie that is made for us. We keep talking about that, and I really wish I was able to respond to it. I do think there are sequences here that are genuinely jaw-dropping, that prove that Steve McQueen is still a great filmmaker. I just don't think the film in totality comes together. And I'm really saddened to say that it just did not land for me.
Yeah, I hate to echo Brendan here, as I really, really wanted to like this film. I was deeply looking forward to it, but I do think it is going to end up as one of the biggest disappointments of the year for me. Don't get me wrong, it is still impeccably crafted. The cinematography, I do think, is remarkable. The performances are really great. Saoirse Ronan is always terrific, but Elliot Heffernan carries this film quite wonderfully. I really liked his performance. Hans Zimmer's score is stirring, and occasionally McQueen reminds us of his experimental ethos, such as those transitional sequences that start out as this close-up of speeding water that quickly fizzle to black and white static before ending on some sort of grainy shot of daffodils, which is to say there is plenty to like here from a craft perspective. The problem is that, and I do agree with you, Brennan, it's just not sure what it wants to be narratively. I don't mind its old-fashioned storytelling. There is something charming about its classic Hollywood ethos in that regard, but the film wants to be three movies at once. On one hand, it is about the Blitz on England during World War II and the devastation that caused, but it's also about racial politics of the time. It's also this story of a mother and son who are separated and are desperate to find each other again. Each one of those through lines are compelling and warrant inclusion, but I don't think the film does a great job of navigating them into one seamless story. Instead, it's a jarring scramble of what seems to be a half-baked script, and McQueen does his best to make it visceral. And I do think he mostly succeeds, because there are some haunting qualities to this film. I think of the moment in the nightclub, or the moment on the train tracks and what takes place there, or George escaping the tunnels after the water pipes burst. McQueen's direction truly is great. He has not lost a step in any way, but I do think his script undermines those harrowing sensibilities. At times he pulls his punches narratively. There's a lot of obvious foreshadowing and basic storytelling. It definitely feels like McQueen, the writer, isn't sure how to speak to McQueen, the director. It is such a weird dynamic in that regard.
Yeah.
But that does ultimately render a very disjointed experience here.
Yeah. It reminded me a little bit of Ridley Scott's Napoleon, of all things, which I have not seen the director's cut of that. But when we talked about that movie, the theatrical cut that we got, we constantly called it an abridged version to something bigger. And I feel like Blitz is kind of the same thing. And I say that because Steve McQueen's last project, or at least his last narrative project, was a 5-part miniseries, essentially. Each part was its own separate movie in a way. Sometimes they almost veered dangerously close to being called short films. One of them was at least an hour long. But then you also had movies like Mangrove, which that was a 2-hour experience. But I think Blitz here, given what we saw, feels like an abridged version for something that was meant to be more thoughtful and lengthier and more informative, because it does have a lot of these ideas on its mind that I think are worthy. I like the idea of tackling a historical subtext like this with the background of racial inequality still lingering, like how history like this can still affect those who were marginalized even at the time, I think is an interesting idea to tackle here. But it feels almost like an afterthought. It feels like a very high level,
I agree.
almost history book like way of just simply putting a stamp on it. And I don't think that's enough to justify a movie telling that point as opposed to just a history book telling that point. So it does feel very, I think you used the term half-baked somewhere in your opening thoughts. I do agree with that. That's ultimately how the film feels, and it's why I didn't feel that moved by it in the end, despite, you know, some of these performances still doing good work. I think Saoirse Ronan can never give a bad performance. It's just unfortunate that the material and the movie itself is not capitalizing on their strengths as much as it should. And that's the biggest unfortunate thing here for me as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that's why I wanted to be careful to say that each one of these through lines, I do think warrant inclusion in this story. Or at the very least, maybe they warrant their own movie where McQueen or another filmmaker can fully examine that within the context of World War II and what was happening in London, in England during this time.
Yeah.
But as it is together, all three of them, they just do not create a cohesive story here. Every time that McQueen would build momentum with one of them, such as, you know, Saoirse Ronan's Rita character and her working at the factory, the devastation she feels having to send her son George off to safety, even though he didn't want to go. And the film is building momentum. It would suddenly shift back, like to a flashback between her and George's father and their relationship, which then gets into the racial dynamic, just completely at odds with one another. Even though separately, though they're fascinating through lines, I understand why McQueen wants to include them here, but they are working against each other narratively in terms of the momentum. And then we shift to something altogether in the next sequence as it relates to the consequences of the raids and the fallout of it, such as, you know, George becoming victim to these different pitfalls throughout London. You know, running into a certain gang at one point, and he gets caught up in that, and then he runs into these three lads on a train, and so it's like, what is this one? What is the identity of this movie? Like, it's all over the place.
That's where the Warhorse comparisons I do think are apt, because it does feel like a series of vignettes of sorts, but Spielberg made it work. Here it does feel very disjointed, and
that's because the horse in Warhorse wasn't having a flashback to
he wasn't really
previous romantic relationship that he had with a different horse.
I think that was the name of the horse, Joey.
Right?
Yeah. Joey wasn't really much of a character. He was more of a cipher for the audience to experience this idea of loss and death among war. So, like, I think that's what made that movie more forgivable in a way. But George, played by Elliot Heffernan here, is a full-fledged character. At least the movie is trying to make him one.
How dare you undermine Joey in that way?
Joey's adorable.
That was a great character.
I did not say he's a bad character. Joey. I just say he's a great cipher, which means he could
that
still
was
be
a great character. I feel like I knew more about Joey at the end of that film than I do any character in this movie.
Well, that just goes to show how problematic this film is. I think that
how good Spielberg is. He can create a full character without any dialogue.
Well, we know that Steve McQueen is, in a way, just as good as Spielberg in his own respective way. This is just not evidence of that, unfortunately. And I do think young Elliot Heffernan here, he shows signs that he is a talented young actor in this movie.
I really liked him.
Yeah, I did too. I didn't feel like he was able to fully carry this thing, but I think that's the movie's fault and not his. I think I don't know if anyone would have been able to carry this particular product. I just think that disjointed nature hinders him too much, which is unfortunate, because I think in individual scenes he is compelling. His reaction shots to certain things I do think are childlike in the right way. He doesn't emotionally express things like an adult would. In fact, he's kind of blank in a way, which is actually what adds to the pain, especially in sequences like that nightclub scene with these bandits that he finds
Oh my
himself.
gosh. Yeah, that's maybe the best scene of the film. Yeah.
It might be, but it also is one of the biggest problems of the movie for me, given the sheer abrasiveness of it, like the ugliness of it, especially for a movie that does have its heart so heavily on its sleeve and is trying to target a younger demographic simultaneously. It's one of the most haunting
It's
things.
trying to be accessible, but it's also haunting at the same time.
Yeah, it's like we've got this young Oliver Twist like narrative, and then all of a sudden we are seeing a bunch of bandits basically fondling dead bodies, right?
Yeah.
It's
which
like,
I kind of appreciate McQueen willing to go there.
Yeah,
yeah,
but I think sometimes you have to pick a little bit of a lane, and it might veer a little too far off the path in order to justify that coexistence. But I mean, it's a harrowing scene. In a vacuum, I do think it is a very good scene, and there are sequences like that throughout that I do think are effective, and they clearly show that Steve McQueen is still a very good filmmaker. It just maybe he needs a writing partner sometimes to tie things together better.
Perhaps, and I do agree the writing is the biggest issue. I guess where I will defend that nightclub moment, that wasn't the first time that showed up in that film.
True.
Like there were a couple of other examples previous to that where McQueen demonstrated that he was willing to go there. And the first
train,
one,
the train
moment was like, okay, McQueen is not here to mess around. I do agree with you. It's still jarring.
Yeah.
The almost childlike sensibility, the classic Hollywood storytelling that preceded that moment, and then you get this shocking moment that you don't necessarily see coming, but it does again elicit the dangers of the time and the dire circumstances these characters find themselves in. So the film establishes that none of these characters are safe and that anything could happen to them at any moment. I mean, even the opening of the scene with the fire hose and the fire kind of engulfing them is quite visceral.
The movie
on its
opens
own as
perfectly.
well.
I've never been that scared of a fire hose in my life.
Yeah, seriously. Like it is quite engrossing. So McQueen does make note, at least in his direction, that he's willing to give this film some harrowing qualities. Does it mesh well with his writing? I agree with you. That is where it is problematic. But when you get to the nightclub scene and what takes place there, I was not jarred by that because the film had already established that McQueen was willing to go there. Now, on its own terms in a vacuum, is it still jarring, especially given the tonal extremes at play? Yeah, I can understand that just because the nature of what's taken place there is a bit
Yeah. I don't mind
ghoulish, I
that
guess.
jarring
Like,
sensibility.
Yeah, but I wasn't like, in terms of the film's momentum, I wasn't jarred or shocked by it because I know McQueen had set that up. My issue isn't the inclusion of it or even the execution of it on its own terms, as much as how the film gets there and how it's interrupted by, the other storytelling aspects we've been talking about. Like there just isn't a lot of momentum that builds up to it. Like that's my biggest issue.
Maybe that's what it is. Yeah,
film.
especially maybe like the scene before it still carries some of that Dickens-like charm that we keep alluding to.
Sure.
So then to suddenly shift to a scene like that, it makes it seem as though it might be the most harrowing thing Steve McQueen has ever put into any one of his movies. It could just be a victim of that type of editing circumstance more than anything else. I think that's fair.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he sets that up. Again, I don't know if it works. It probably doesn't, but I do find the setup there kind of captivating because he spends at least 3 or 4 minutes inside of that nightclub where it is vivacious, there's energy, there's singing, and we get this swooping camera movement showing everyone inside the club having a great time. We know none of these characters. The film literally pauses. It takes us away from George. It takes us away from Rita. It takes us away from Grandpa or however they call him here. I can't remember.
Granddad, I think they call him. Yeah, played
that's
by
right.
Paul Weller.
Exactly. Like, we move away from every character that we were introduced to our completely random nightclub for at least 3 or 4 minutes.
Oh,
and it
this
is
is
again, it's vibrant. There's a lot of energy to it. And and then you see the aftermath, and it's like, oh, that's why he set it up that way. Again, in terms of the editing and the inclusion, does it work? I don't know. I really question it. Like, even as it was happening in real time, I'm like, why are we here? Like, what is the point of this? And then he gives us the answer to that.
He gives us the answer. It just takes 5 minutes to get there. That scene is precisely why I said earlier, I think this would have made a great miniseries as opposed to just a feature movie on its own terms. Because that scene there feels like let's say hypothetically, if this were maybe a 5-part miniseries and it told this large connected story, that scene feels like it could have been the opening for maybe episode 4 or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And I want to be careful with that, because we often praise movies for breaking the conventional narrative norms, right? And in a way, this movie is doing that. And by fixing it in the way that I just suggested, makes it seem like it's going a more conventional route. But I think in this case, it doesn't feel like Steve McQueen trying to be bold and daring with his narrative choices. It honestly just feels wrongfully choppy. I really think that's why I have to criticize it in that way, and why we both are. The editing here and the sequence of events, it doesn't feel like there's a mathematical rhyme or reason for some of it. I actually feel like if you were to re-edit this movie and completely change the way it's told and in what order, it doesn't really change the movie that much, which is kind of a problem in a way. Like, I don't know if it really affects anything all that much.
I mean, I do think there is some boldness to it, again, because the film is so committed to that Charles Dickens tone that we've been talking about, that to subvert that with these haunting moments in this film. Like, I do love the ambition there.
Fair.
The implementation of it, I do agree there is a feebleness there. The editing doesn't really quite work.
Yeah.
And I don't know what the story was in terms of the writing for Steve McQueen. Did he have full control of the final edit? I don't really know the behind the scenes there, but it does feel as if Steve McQueen was kind of lost and frantic trying to figure out how to tell this story, which is honestly maybe the most jarring thing about this film, because I've never really experienced that with Steve McQueen. And this is a guy that
he's always been very confident
and full control of his vision in every single film that he's made. That to see this come out, like, I don't know, like, it feels like a completely different person made this movie.
It feels incomplete. The movie does feel kind of incomplete to me. But I do think there are sequences here, like we keep talking about, that are effective. Some performances that are effective. Best performance in the movie for me is actually Lee Gill, who plays, I think, Mickey Davies. He's the one that runs this volunteer group underground that Rita eventually joins. So, of course, here is Lee Gill continuing his trend of giving really great performances in movies from this year that don't deserve him. The other one being Joker Folia
2. Seriously. Yeah, he's had a great year in 2 not great movies.
But he might give my favorite performance here, honestly.
He is fantastic. I really liked Benjamin Clementine as well. As, I forget how to say that character's name. Ify? Is that how he says it?
Oh, yes. Ify, I believe it was.
I really like him a lot as well. And again, you have to talk about that character in a vacuum, because when it's, when you're putting it up against the movie that's trying to be about the Blitz, and it's trying to be about this mother and son trying to find each other, it is a bit disjointed. And I mean, and because the scenes with that character aren't about helping George get back to his mother. That might be what it is on the surface. But that whole sequence with him is about the relationship he forms with George as it relates to one, George not having a father figure in his life, and to not having a black figure in his life either, right? Because his mother and granddad are white.
Yeah.
And so the film within its racial dynamics and racial politics the film is wanting to explore that and how that is an important factor among the Blitz and given the tensions of the time. And look, all of that is, again, it's warranted to explore. I just don't think it works seamlessly with everything else that's happening here.
Yeah, they just feel like bullet points, like they have to be here. I think they're worthwhile talking points. It actually helps justify why George feels the need to always run whenever the law enforcement gets involved in some way, right?
Yeah.
There's a little bit of a through line there, which I do think is fascinating. I don't think the movie does enough to turn it into an emotional point as opposed to just a topical one, right?
Exactly.
I think that's missing for me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I couldn't have said it better myself. So that's ultimately why I don't think it services the film from a larger point of view. But the character in a vacuum is so compelling. And I love Clementine's performance. I love the character and what it means for George and how he embraces who he is. That is so charming. That is so endearing. I love that. And of course, given what I was talking about in my opening thoughts, as far as the film's obvious, very, very painfully obvious foreshadowing, like how that film crystallizes is something you see coming 1,000 miles away. But that aside, I like the performance. I like what the character represents fundamentally, even if it's not fully realized in the larger context of everything here.
Yeah, I agree. I wanted to love this movie so much. I really did.
I did too.
I'm sad. I'm sad. This was so tailor-made for us, man.
I know it was. Yeah. I mean, halfway through this film, and I saw this after Anora, and I remembered my lesson. So I was like, I'm going to see how this plays out. But halfway through the film, I was there again by myself. I was like, man, this is well on its way to being maybe the most disappointing film of the year for me. And it never really did get a whole lot better. I mean, there are individual scenes here I love, such as the moment of George there in the tunnels. He wakes up, walks through the tunnel, finds himself in this very specific place. Like
that's a good scene.
If that moment in a great film might be a scene of the year contender for me.
Yeah.
I think it is really great, and it means so much to George in the larger context of everything, but because of how disjointed this film is, it just doesn't carry the weight I think it should have.
I'm with you.
But
I'm with you. It's why even the ending itself, I think, feels wrongfully anticlimactic. Yeah, that's the word I was just about to use, man.
It's exactly like yeah.
I mean, I get how in a situation like this, given Georgie's situation, how fleeting some of these moments are, how fleeting it is to have someone in your life that's gonna keep an eye on you and protect you, only for that to end without ever having a chance to say goodbye or to give it some closure or some finality. I get that. The movie ends in a way that kind of has that, but it simultaneously makes us sit there and think, wait, that's it? Which, if the point is to be a bit fleeting, it still needs to arrive to that point in an emotional way that makes it feel complete and earned. And this does not do that.
I agree. I completely agree. Another thought here, not to add more punches to the gut here, but what was the point of Harris Dickinson in this film?
I do not know. I do
it just
not
serves nothing
know.
at all. Yeah.
He rescues Rita from some bricks.
That's it. Like the most meaningless character. Like at least Ivy and Granddad and like all these other characters that we've talked about, Mickey, the Lee Gill character, like at least there's purpose to them. And like, in a vacuum, those characters are really great and compelling. Jack just comes and goes no purpose.
There was
to it at all.
potential there, though. There was
It
potential.
feels like
for
there was
Jack
a lot on the cutting room floor.
Yeah,
with that
like
character.
I was sitting there thinking, okay, the movie's maybe alluding at a possible romance between Jack and Rita, or at
Yeah.
least it's alluding to the fact
That's
that
what it's hinting
Jack
at.
is but Jack is the one that's smitten by Rita, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's an interesting idea to have that type of interaction potentially play out, especially given the fact that Rita was originally in love with a black man. So I think that's something that could have potentially added some nuance to the film's racial backdrop that it was playing with, kind of creating a new situation around that. And how does George himself, as her son, see that if it does go in that direction? Like
Yeah.
there was a potential idea there, a seed of an idea, but it's not. There's no life that comes from it. And maybe
No.
I'm just spitballing. Maybe that's not what the film was trying to get at with the Jack character, but I feel like there was room to play in that sandbox. It just doesn't really do anything.
Yeah, I do. I appreciate where you're trying to go with that interpretation.
Trying to give it some benefit of the doubt.
Trying to give it some benefit of the doubt, and I think you're doing a great job of giving this film a lot of credit for something that I don't think is there at all.
Oh, I don't think it's there. I just think
the idea you're talking about is compelling. I agree. I just don't think the film. I just don't think
it doesn't
there
explore
in the movie, though.
No.
But the
I'm not
opportunity
saying
was there.
I'm not. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it as a defense. I'm saying it as. I'm actually bringing it up as something that hurts the film even more by just simply presenting an opportunity.
Yeah, no, it's perfectly understandable. But that character, man, that just serves no purpose. Complete waste of time. And Harris Dickinson, I love him as a performer. Like casting him to do that role, I don't.
Yeah,
that's why I feel like there's got to be something in the editing. There's got to be a lot more to that character that didn't make the final cut, because otherwise, why are you casting him in an absolutely nothing role?
I know.
I don't get that.
I don't know.
I don't get that at all.
I don't know. It baffles me. I wanted to like this so much more. This really did not work for me. Easily my least favorite from Steve McQueen thus far.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you there. No, wholeheartedly agree. Any final thoughts on Blitz? Say that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, just I'm sad. I'm sad.
Yeah, sad too.
I will say I'm looking up who the editor for the film was. Peter Scabaris. He was also the editor on films like The Power of the Dog and The Rover. So
oh wow.
Okay, so I didn't like the editing of the film here, but now I'm starting to think it really wasn't his fault. It's the script.
It's got to be the screenplay.
It's got to be the script. Yeah,
the
it's got to be,
screenplay is
and how the
really
script
good.
would then create a storyboarding process that just has a jumbled nature to it. It's I think in that case maybe editor Peter Scabaris was just dealt a bad hand.
Yeah, I agree. My last final thought here. There's a lot of, at least there was a lot of talk about Saoirse Ronan. Is she going to be double nominated this year? Because she also has The Outrun, which we reviewed some weeks ago. I really like that film a lot. Her performance is a powerhouse. I do think it is one of the best performances of the year. I don't see her being double nominated. I don't either. I don't think she's going to be nominated for this film. And maybe that's what the punditry is also echoing. I'm honestly not too sure. I need to check with our own Shadon Larkey.
Yeah.
As you know, because I know soon she's going to be getting into her predictions. So maybe I'll just wait for that episode to drop. Because there was some talk, at least before the release of the film, with her performance here.
Yeah.
I just don't see it though. I don't
either.
I think she's fine here, but the screenplay again really undermines the performance.
Yeah, it really does. I agree.
All right. Well, with all of that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, hit us up. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. You can email us in sessionfilm@gmail.com. You can hit us up on Letterboxd as well. But we would love to hear you. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you really like Blitz. I would love to know.
I know some people who do like it. The general consensus seems to be that it is a bit of a disappointment for most people. Definitely one of Steve McQueen's lesser films, but Yeah, I do know some critics out there who have went for it. There are some people out there that do like it.
Yeah, and if that's the case, I'm glad. I'm glad that you liked the film. It certainly wasn't for us, unfortunately.
Yeah.
With that said, though, go check out our conversation on Sean Baker's Anora. That is available right now. We had a really great time talking about that movie. Episode 610, the main show this week, we talk about Clint Eastwood. We talk about Star Wars and Mission Impossible. It was a really great time. The aforementioned Chasing the Gold, that is coming very soon, probably tomorrow as this episode is released, so you can be on the lookout for that. And a new Women in Session out this week as well. So go and check all of that out. Brendan, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Watch Anora.
Anora. Yeah, Anora's great.
Yeah.
It's really, really good. Sean Baker, man, he knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
So with all of that said, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Still like Steve McQueen, though. Still great director.
Great filmmaker.
Love him.